Okay. So maybe you could start off by introducing yourself a little bit.
Sure. My name is Huck Hodge. I am a composer living in Seattle, Washington. My musical background has taken me to various places around the world. I'm originally from the West Coast. I grew up in Oregon. I went to school in Germany, in Stuttgart, and then did graduate school in New York at Columbia University. And now I'm back on the West Coast teaching at the University of Washington.
Nice. Okay. What is the initial inspiration behind most of your compositions?
I mean, I guess there's the maybe sort of poetic answer, and then there's the practical answer. The practical answer is usually that most of my pieces are on commission, and there's usually a specific ensemble, performing body that is going to do it. And so a lot of the inspiration comes from the characteristics of the ensemble that I'm writing for. That's the practical answer, as I say, which is maybe not that interesting, although I think it's sort of, there are ways to, be a little bit more poetic about even that practical constraint. Like, for instance, right now, the piece I most recently finished is for a group in New York called Ekumelis, which is a vocal ensemble. There are 6 vocalists, so it's sort of like a madrigal sort of ensemble, but they're well known for singing microtonal music.
Oh.
And so, in approaching that piece, there's a whole history of music for that type of ensemble, although it's sort of interesting that maybe from around, say, 1650 until maybe about, the early 20th century, there's not a lot of music written for 6 a cappella voices. And so the history has some gaps in it, which are perhaps sort of interesting. But I like to incorporate the history as a part of the composition. And so this particular piece, it's drawing from certain medieval traditions. The piece itself won't sound medieval at all, but it's based on certain aspects of medieval music theory, which is somewhat complicated, but if you've ever heard of Guido of Arezzo and the Guidonian hand and early solfege and that kind of stuff, I incorporate some of that into the piece. It's also interesting because my mother passed away last year, and it just so happens that one of the pitch collections in medieval music theory called the hexachordum durum, the dur hexachord or the hard hexachord, shares notes that it's basically G, A, B, C, D, E, those notes. But I was able to, spell my mother's name with those notes, those note letters. Wonderful. And so it's like both sort of a dedication to my mother, but then also it is a pun on this medieval music theory. And that was all drawn from a few sources, obviously, but the main impetus was the fact that I'm writing for 6 a cappella singers, and there's this whole tradition of medieval and Renaissance music that I wanted to appeal to. It's the same like if I write a string quartet or something. A lot of people talk about the history of classical music as being kind of daunting or overbearing in a few different ways. There's a composer who you probably have heard of named David Lang who talks about how, being a composer today is sort of like being a baseball player, except that the greats from the last 100 years of baseball are still playing the game.
Yeah, that's true.
And so it's like, it's fairly hard to find your way out from under the history as well. Okay. But I like to try to incorporate sort of, strange perspectives on the history of music into what I do. And a lot of that's drawn simply from the practical considerations of what instruments or what group I'm writing for.
Okay. So, like, adding on to that, you make sure to stay true to your artistic identity, like what you originally always planned to do?
Well, what I always plan to do, that's an interesting question. There is an idea in classical music, and this goes back at least to Aristotle and the ancient Greeks, this idea that what a artist does, in our case, what a composer does, is realize some vision, some purpose, some plan, some idea that they have, a design. And the artwork is just the execution of that design. Yeah. But I find that is pretty inaccurate. That's not at all, that does not match my experience of writing a piece at all, because when I start writing a piece, I have no idea what I'm going to do, generally.
I see.
And even after I finish the piece, it takes me a while to recognize what I've done. What I mean by that is recognize all of the connections, all of the associations that I wasn't even aware of while I was writing, this kind of thing. And so being true to myself, I look at it kind of this way. There's a German composer who just passed away last summer named Wolfgang Ring, who says that all of his pieces, any given piece, is actually just the articulated search for the piece. Okay. In other words, while you're writing the piece, you're actually looking for the piece. You don't know what the piece is until you've finished it.
It's hard to find a plan in the beginning, so you just go
along with it.
It's hard
to find a plan in the beginning, but even more than that, it's a recognition that to be true to yourself is to recognize that to have a self at all, to have an identity, to have a personal identity is always a work in progress. You might think that you fit certain identity groups or that you know who you are, and some people do perhaps know who they are from an early age, but I think that to be really true to yourself is to recognize that you're always changing, you're always developing, growing, your interests and commitments are changing, and to be true to that is to be true to the fact of change, to the fact of this ongoing process, not knowing what comes next, or at least not predefining before the fact what is going to happen, what is going to, say, happen in your life, to maybe sell yourself short in terms of your own identity by thinking that you're a certain type of person with a certain background who has certain commitments, and then that makes it impossible to pursue things that don't fit that. I think that is a way to be untrue to yourself.
Okay. Yeah. I guess also connecting to that, with the change part, are there any sort of music compositions that you're particularly excited to go into in the future?
That you mean things that I want to write in the future? I don't know. I get excited on whatever I'm working on at any given time.
Okay. Any new directions that you might be going into? Or?
New directions. I don't know. I mean, one thing, I guess it's kind of a non-answer, or maybe it's not a particularly flashy answer. But I think that one thing I'm happy about having found where I am now with writing music is that I don't feel like I have to do things that I don't necessarily like just because they will seem interesting or attractive or flashy to other people.
Okay.
That's good. So one thing I say, I don't know. I mean, I could give you a bunch of technical descriptors about what I do or historical influences or whatever. But I think that probably the most apt way to get at the heart of what I do is I like to tell stories. And I don't even necessarily mean that I like to write programmatic music or something like that. I mean, more like I want whenever you come to the end of listening to a piece of mine to feel like you've finished a journey of some sort, and to take a breath and feel like, you are maybe in a different place from where you began the piece. And even if the music kind of comes back in cycles around to the beginning again, as is a typical formal kind of idea, I like the endings to feel transformed somehow, you know. And so for me, musical narrative understood as, you know, a strong sense of having arrived at some place that is transformed someplace new by the end of a piece. You know, that's what I love, and I love when pieces do that well. As I said, that's a really general kind of thing. Like almost any good piece of music does that, but it's notice I said almost any good piece of music does that. Yeah. Because there are a lot of pieces of music that, you know, maybe don't do that. There's some question about whether or not that's, you know, objectively good or whatever. I doubt it is. I suppose there are other ways you can evaluate music. It's just that that's the sort of feeling I like to have when I listen to a piece of music, and is the sort of feeling I like to have when I accomplish that in my own music.
I see. Okay. In your opinion, what are the biggest challenges faced by contemporary composers and performers within the music industry today?
Well, there are lots of them. I mean, maybe part of it is the fact that we consider what we do to be a music industry as opposed to making music for other reasons that are non-industrial. You know, so that's one thing that's always there, the specter of neoliberal capitalism and not being able to think of yourself and what you do as anything other than a personal brand and that sort of thing is maybe at odds with other ways that music could be, other purposes music could have. Another sort of difficulty, I suppose, is I'm not sure if it's a difficulty or if it's a good thing, but if you were to consider the concept of common practice, right? Performance practice or community and this kind of thing. I mean, I'm not sure. It's certainly true that there is no common practice, but it doesn't mean that there are no common practices. There are way too many common practices, or that is to say there are many practices and none of them are common, right? Yeah. You know, that is to say there's sort of like a micro ecology of hundreds and hundreds of different approaches to writing a piece of, say, quote unquote, classical music. I'm not sure that that's a bad thing. In fact, there are definitely good things about it. I guess maybe in terms of, you know, I guess so whether or not it's good is going to depend on what you hope or what you might think the purposes of being a composer are. I mean, so one thing that seems like it's not going to happen anytime soon or maybe ever again is that you'll have a figure like Beethoven.
Oh, yeah.
Right, and it's not because people aren't writing music that's as good as Beethoven. It's that there's not the same sort of one common practice across, you know, all different composers and this sort of thing. But the other thing about it is that I think classical music is just not seen to be, it's certainly in the United States, as culturally significant as it was in the 19th century.
Well, yeah, for sure.
You know, but then you might think, if that's what you want, then it's really bad that there's no common practice, because maybe having a common practice is necessary for having that sort of, you know, world historic composer figure like Beethoven. But if that doesn't matter, if there are other ways to think about what it means to be a successful, accomplished, good composer, then it might be a good thing that there are lots and lots of micro styles, micro practices, and this kind of thing. You know, but then that also connects to that idea of music as an industry, classical music as an industry, because the more micro styles, micro practices there are, the less likely it is that the industry could ever produce this sort of, you know, monopoly figure that Beethoven is, you know. And so it's like, and so maybe the distribution of music on the internet and this kind of thing would help in that regard. But then we're all sort of tied to wanting to be the next Beethoven at the same time.
Yeah, I mean,
so like, it's kind of a catch-22, right? Because it's like we constantly look back at the past as the model, but that's probably not the right way to think about what we do. And it's also true that one side of the industry is the notion of, like ensembles, orchestras as institutions, as industries, and this kind of thing. And I mean, they are very closely still tied to the 19th century ideal. But it does seem to me that if we could think of a new sort of ideal, a new sort of purpose for classical music, we might not necessarily have to think of the lack of a common practice, but then also the diminishing stature of classical music in American society as a problem. We might be able to figure out something that we can do where that's not a problem and maybe even is a benefit. If, for instance, one thing that people sometimes say is that even though there's no figure like Beethoven today, there are way more composers living and working today than at any previous time in history. So that's good from a certain perspective, although if you're one of those composers and you have a dream of becoming the next Beethoven, that's bad. But maybe if what we value is just the distribution of music and not tying it to the identity of a specific composer or whatever, but just like the transmission of ideas freely in the most wide-reaching way, then the lack of a common practice and the existence of the internet would be really good.
That's true.
So it really depends on what you want music to be, what you want the social influence or role of music to be, and so on.
So do you believe that there are any new things that could impact it positively right now with the purpose of classical music?
I mean, to a certain extent, I do think that the it's so hard. I mean, this is kind of a question with all sorts of media, not just music. But, one thing that we see in classical music is, at least with respect to things like recording and, or I'll say in contemporary music, classical music is actually a little bit different in this regard. But with respect to like recording and broadcasting and distribution of albums and this kind of thing, one maybe positive change is the fact that people can be their own publisher and so on. You can put your music out on Bandcamp if you want or whatever. You're not at the mercy of somebody in an office on Park Avenue, Of course, then the question is, are you trading breadth for depth, right? That is to say, if there's kind of a more powerful, say, recording corporation or something that can distribute fewer people's music more widely than is the case with something like self-publishing or Bandcamp, is it actually, are individual composers worse off? I mean, that's a question for all sorts of media, but I do think in general the kind of whatever YouTube approach or whatever, the less centralized, less kind of the less centralized approach to distributing music is probably a good thing that will help people, help ideas. It might not help people feed themselves or become famous, but I think it will help ideas proliferate.
Okay.
So is it clear what I mean by that when I say it'll help ideas proliferate, even if it doesn't necessarily help people feed themselves?
Not really.
Oh, okay. Well, I'll explain that. What I mean is just that, most composers living today, this isn't true across the board, but like probably 95% of living composers don't make enough money from their music, from writing music and so on to feed themselves. They have to have jobs like in academia or elsewhere, right? And one reason, there are lots of reasons for that, but one reason is, I think, due to the fact that there are, there's a lot more composers working today, so there's a lot more competition.
Yes.
But then also a lot of the well-known corporations, recording corporations, broadcasting corporations, and this kind of thing aren't really doing anything with certainly with contemporary music anymore, which was not the case, say, 50 years ago. So when I say that the model of, say, like YouTube distribution is not particularly good for feeding yourself, but it is good for getting your ideas out there.
Okay, yes.
Right? So ideas can proliferate, although maybe at the expense of having, these opportunities to be a self-sufficient composer where you don't have a day job teaching or something like that. Yeah. That's what I meant by that.
Okay, thank you. So on top of that, that would be making it more accessible to a wider audience, or getting more people to, listen and be interested into contemporary music?
Maybe. I mean, I don't know. I'm not. So the problem is, and this gets back to the sort of micro practices idea. I'm not sure that there's a single thing that we're talking about when we say contemporary music or even contemporary classical music. I mean, one upshot of that is that there are lots and lots and lots of different audiences, and some of the audiences are pretty small. Some are, the styles of contemporary music that are closer to already established audiences are going to be larger. So that means people like Philip Glass, who's kind of pop music adjacent, or, orchestral classical music adjacent, they kind of tap into larger audiences, and people that work in, say, like new complexity, really, hardcore, like avant-garde kind of stuff, have smaller audiences. But those audiences exist, and they're dedicated. They're kind of small, they're quite small in comparison to, say, the pop music world or whatever. But so, to the question, what role does the audience play in all of that? I mean, I guess it comes back to what you think the purpose of creating music, creating art is. I mean, if the purpose is to, say, have like the maximum distribution of your music and the maximum profit from, say, ticket sales or streaming or all this kind of stuff, then it's pretty important to write music that is going to sell lots of tickets and get lots of streams.
Yes.
If that's not the purpose, if you have some other purpose, like the distribution of a maybe beautifully fragile new idea that most people won't get, and if that's more important than making lots of money, then you take a different approach, right? Yeah. And so, that's one thing that might be good about the lack of a common practice, the fact that you can determine for yourself what the point of being a composer is.
Yes.
What I generally tell my students is follow what you want to do the best version of what you want, and you'll find an audience. There are audiences out there for pretty much anything that is done well. Yeah. And in fact, something that's done well for one audience, if you give it to another audience, they might hate it. So you can alienate certain audiences by doing something well that's not intended for that given audience. And you also have very little control over what other people are going to think about your music. Yeah. So I find that I'm my own best and worst critic. I'm extremely harsh about my own music, more harsh than anybody else is ever going to be. And if I'm happy, I'm satisfied with that, and I recognize that there are people that will like what I do, and there are people that won't like what I do, and I can't really do much about that, but I can try to be, I won't say be true to myself, because I don't necessarily believe in that kind of rhetoric, but I'll say I'll do what I would like to hear. I'll write what I would like to hear, what I would like to see happen, and I'll follow that. And so far, I've found people that like what I do, and that's been satisfying for me.
Great. Okay. So sort of, this is a completely different thing, but what are your thoughts on AI? I mean, it's there, so.
Yeah, that's a big topic. What are my thoughts on it? Well, I mean, AI has existed for a long, long time.
Yes.
And even in contemporary music, there's, a 60 or so year history of, say, algorithmic composition and computer-assisted composition and this kind of thing. And it's also the case that the large language models that are making all the headlines these days still don't really know how to process musical data sets, sonic data sets, and so on. So the answer I give now is probably the answer I would have given 20 years ago. I see AI as a tool. In general, I think it's extremely useful for acting as a kind of idea springboard, that is, I mean, I do this for, like, when I need to write words, too. I might kind of throw up some strange question on, say, ChatGPT or something and see what it comes up with. And usually the answers aren't terribly satisfying, although it's gotten better in the last, 2 years. But what I have found, though, is that there's usually one word or two words that are a strange choice to put together, and that sparks something in my own imagination. And so I don't really use the results except as a way to suggest things that are maybe outside of what I would have expected myself. Let me give you maybe an even stronger example of this kind of thing. And it's also an observation that kind of charts some of the changes in AI that I think are bad for art. Let me put it this way. Have you done much with Stable Diffusion or the image generators in AI?
I have a little bit.
A little bit,
yes.
Yeah. So it's interesting, when those first started becoming well known, the images that they would produce were always a little weird. In fact, sometimes really weird, right? And for instance, I remember way back, what's the other one called? Dali.
Okay.
I asked Dali to generate some musical scores and see what it would look like. And it was interesting because it vaguely looked like what a musical score would look like in a dream. Right? Okay, I mean, you could see there little circles that look kind of like note heads or little stems or whatever, but things weren't organized in any way that you could read in, standard musical system. And that's where I find the artistry of AI. That is to say, in its way to bring together things that don't literally connect to each other in waking life in a sort of logical analysis, right? It's or you see, my favorite would be over the last many years, maybe, I guess I started doing it when I was a teenager. I'm in my 40s now. So over the last 30 years or so, I've kept a journal off and on. When I have a dream, I try to write it down so I don't forget it. And that's really great, by the way. For one thing, it helps you remember your dreams. Even after you forget your dreams, I find if I go back and find something that I wrote several years ago, I will have forgotten the dream, but when I read it, those same images pop back up in my mind. I know exactly what the images were from my dream from 10 years ago. It's really interesting. But what I started to do was, I had these little paragraphs or whatever written up, and then I started entering that as the prompt in Dali to see what would happen. And so the images would try to put together snapshots from my dreams. which is pretty cool. But one of the things that I found was and this is something that has been quote unquote fixed now.
Okay.
One thing that I found was that so I had a dream a long time ago where it was like a really bad nightmare, and it was just like a room with like purple fluorescent light. It was an empty room, but there was a desk and some weird old deformed guy sitting at the desk, and there was a stereo and a tape cassette, and on the cassette was written the word demon.
Oh.
And then he said, he put the tape in the cassette player, and then he said, once you hear this, it will never leave, or something like that. And he pressed play, and it was the most horrible sound you can imagine.
Oh my God.
And I woke up. And I entered that, like I said, okay, Dolly, show me a tape cassette that has the word demon written on it in a purple fluorescent room, et cetera, et cetera. And it tried to do it. And most of the objects looked kind of like the things that I described, but the word demon, you could kind of see that word there a little bit, but it had like a 5 in the middle of it and like some backwards letters and some things that weren't letters at all. And that's what I find really, really beautiful and artistic. It's that non-literal relationship to the actual world that you see in dreams or that you see in kind of faulty AI. But one of the things we see now as AI gets more efficient or more realistic is that kind of stuff falls away, and you start to see images that are more or less indistinguishable from just regular photographs.
Yeah.
Which means it's not artistic in the same way that this sort of dreamy, poetic, metaphoric representation of an image is. You know, and I see that there's like a diminishing kind of like artistic sense in AI because it's oriented towards the goal of efficiency and realism.
Okay.
Right? And I think that that's one thing to take away from AI, that AI itself, it really depends on what your purposes are, because if it produces these things that are really metaphorical and not literal and dreamy, but also awaken all these connections that you wouldn't have thought of yourself in a sort of literal sense, that can be extremely artistic. But the problem is these corporations want to use it to replace human beings in regular kind of practical jobs of, like, you know, writing newspaper articles or, you know, doing voiceovers. And it moves towards efficiency and realism, which moves away from art. So the real problem isn't AI. The problem is the societal value of efficiency, right? Okay. The societal value of realism. And I suppose all of that is somehow associated with, you know, maximizing, you know, profits and capital and minimizing expenses. That's the problem, not AI.
The way we're using it.
Okay. Yeah, exactly. The way you're using it, oriented towards something that's not art.
Yeah, I see.
Right. So anyway, that's my take.
Okay. Okay. Just a couple more questions. But are there any programs or educational programs that you find you're familiar with and that it could promote this, you know, classical contemporary music?
By educational programs, you mean like festivals or where? I'm not sure exactly.
Sure. Yeah.
Oh, well, yeah, there are quite a few. I mean, I hadn't prepared a whole list of them, but there's some quite well-known ones in the United States and in Europe. Let's see, you're in Princeton, so I'm trying to think.
I mean, at a summer program that I go to, we usually have a trimester of playing contemporary chamber music in string quartets, so that's the experience I have with it. But yeah, it's...
Yeah, well, I mean, I guess like the well-known ones in the U.S. are like Aspen. There's a newer one that's been around for about 10 years now called New Music on the Point, although I'm not sure with... a lot of them are more for college-age students, and I'm not sure exactly for like the pre-college crowd if I should probably apply and everything. I'm not sure. I've never really thought about pre-college stuff. I've only looked at the college age ones. Honestly, for pre-college, I don't know a bunch. I'm sure that there's like the Juilliard pre-college, which I think you're right, and that sort of thing. Are you interested in like the college age programs too, or what?
Sure, maybe
I'm just
later.
thinking of how to answer that question.
No, I was just thinking of like programs for students to just, get interested into it, because I think at the moment it's just mainly, it's just classical music and all those things. But
I see.
Okay.
I see. It's sort of interesting. One thing that I saw once in Taiwan, or is this in Taiwan? Yeah, this was in Taiwan, which I've never seen before. And actually, at least for, Taiwan and in Taipei, it worked really well. And I've never seen anything like this in the United States or Europe, it was a concert it was like a children's concert of contemporary music. And by children, I mean like 6 to 10-year-olds or whatever. And so it's a mix of like some, child friendly classical music, but then there was like some pretty like hardcore like serial atonal stuff too. A lot of it were not full pieces, just like excerpts, but it was put together in like a whole like story format, and there were like some actors and some dancers together with the ensembles playing this kind of thing. Unfortunately, everything was in Chinese, so I couldn't really figure out exactly. I asked my hosts later exactly what they were talking about. So I don't know exactly like what all the story building aspect of it was, but I thought that was really cool, and the kids loved it. Here's one thing that I've noticed about contemporary music, and in particular, like contemporary music that's oriented more towards like noise and stuff, or extend technique or whatever, is like babies and children who are maybe younger than 2 love it. They think it's the coolest thing. They laugh whenever there's a squeak on the violin or whatever. They think it's really cool. And it's something about like, I guess what it is that they haven't formed a bunch of assumptions about what music is supposed to do, or what, constitutes good music or whatever. They just like the squeaks or the weird noises or all this kind of stuff. It's like a toy, but I've seen that quite a lot, because I have a daughter, and my friends have friends have children and whatnot, and a lot of times we've played our music for them, and they always really respond well to it. And so I think that kind of approach could be kind of interesting, because nobody's doing that, at least in the U.S. I've never seen anything like that. But not assuming that contemporary music is like necessarily difficult and painful and all these kinds of things that people often associate with it. I think that it can be pretty joyous and pretty silly and interesting for kids. So like if you were interested in putting together a program, that might be something that nobody else is doing. That would be interesting.
That would be really cool. Okay, we have this Zoom meeting is like going to stop, but a lot of so I guess adding on to that, it's like definitely trained into us and ingrained into us like what classical music is supposed to be like. So I guess you said that. Do you have any tips for understanding this sort of new music?
Yeah, I mean, here's one way that
Okay.
Hi
Hi again.
Did you put a timer or something on that?
Yeah, I did. I'm sorry.
Oh, that's fine. I didn't realize that. I would have made my answers shorter if I had known that.
It's okay. Okay.
Let me just answer your last question,
Yes.
which maybe ask it again, just so
I guess saying, like, do you have any tips for understanding new classical music?
Yeah. So this is going to be one of these kind of like tough love kind of answers, or maybe it's a little too general too. But let me tell you something that a student of mine once said, and this was in a class where this was a class I taught at Columbia University, and it was not for musicians. Most of the people didn't have a background in music at all, but it was like the history of classical music or something like that. And we were listening to or talking about John Cage's 4 minutes 33 seconds.
Oh,
and about half the class hated it, and maybe 1/4 of the class liked it, and then another quarter was like just totally confused or something. And the people that didn't like it said, "Oh, this is so stupid. It's so boring. What am I supposed to do with this? La la la," that kind of thing. And then one of the students who appreciated it said, a lot of times, in fact, most of the time, people always ask what a piece of music can do for them, how they can use it, right? Yeah. But a piece like 4 minutes, 33 seconds actually asks its audience to do something for it. In other words, it's a way of asking yourself, can I change the way that I experience the world, right? Can I come to the piece with fresh mind, with fresh ears, this kind of thing. And actually, it's almost like an exercise in self-improvement. Or it's an exercise in getting over your ego to a certain extent, right? And I think that that's probably the best attitude to come to contemporary music with. Just an open desire to have your assumptions about the world, destabilized or questioned, or but I don't even mean it in that kind of that almost sounds kind of aggressive. I just mean like just try to come to every piece of music with a sense of wonder and joy, and not expect that it's going to do something for you. Okay. Right. Yeah. So. That's what I would say. I, as I said, it's kind of tough love in a way. Yeah. Right? Because most people don't want to hear that. But I think it's true, and I think that kind of attitude would make the world a better place in general if most people could listen openly.
I agree. Yeah. Okay. I think that was good.
Okay. Well, thank you for the interview.
Thank you so much for meeting with me.
Yeah.
Okay.
Great. Well, take care.
Bye, you too.